we do need to be careful. I mean, China, we're not going to change China. If China changes, the change will come from within.
First this hour to China, where there are reports of more clashes between police and protesters, this time in the southern city of Guangzhou. Demonstrations against strict COVID lockdowns have escalated and spread across the country. Footage from Guangzhou, shared online, appears to show police in white hazmat suits using riot shields to protect themselves from debris thrown at them by protesters. Well, earlier I spoke to Nigel Inkster, former Director of Operations and Intelligence at MI6, now a Senior Advisor on China and Cyber at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I asked him what he made of the growing dissent in parts of China.
Well, I think obviously the proximate cause of these has been pushback against these very draconian COVID measures that have been imposed on the population. And essentially what's happened is that, over the last 2 or 3 years, ordinary Chinese people have found themselves experiencing what we might term everyday authoritarianism in a way that just hadn't happened before. Up until 2020, people in Chinese cities pretty much were able to get on with their lives without undue interference from the government, from the party state, and that is now changing. So I think, although the COVID restrictions are the proximate cause, there are deeper underlying unhappinesses about a progressively more authoritarian trend within China. And I think in particular, young people, university graduates in particular, are seeing the walls coming in. They're seeing their opportunities diminishing, very high levels of graduate unemployment. And they're being told increasingly that their dreams and aspirations will only be valid if they correlate with those of the Chinese party state.
And the demonstrations have changed in their nature, haven't they? They may have begun specifically about these very tough lockdown rules and the way they are enforced. But now we're seeing protesters openly chanting against President Xi, against his regime.
Yeah, so you hear them saying, Xi Jinping step down, Communist Party stand down, and holding up blank sheets of A4 paper in protest against censorship and inability to express themselves freely. So I think this is a culmination of a lot of frustrations that have grown during the period of COVID restrictions. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party will change course as a result of what's been happening, but I think they'll try to be as clever as they can in dealing with the protests with minimal force, unless things start to get a lot worse and they have to act. We've seen that what they've been doing is they've been identifying individual protesters, grabbing their phone numbers and then ringing them up as a means of intimidation. They have arrested people. They've deployed large numbers of paramilitary police in the cities, but with instructions to go easy, at least for now. So I think they're going to be quite cautious in how they handle these protests, but they're not going to let them run.
Because part of the problem is that they've still got very high levels of COVID infections. And although they're talking about stepping up the vaccination campaign, the vaccine they're using doesn't seem to be working very well. So, I mean, part of the problem, I guess, is that even if they relax the restrictions, the danger is that you then get a really dangerous spread of the virus.
Yeah, so China has very much worse healthcare facilities than developed Western economies in terms of numbers of hospitals, ICUs, and so on. As you said, it's not that the Chinese vaccines are completely ineffective. They are effective at warding off extreme symptoms and death to some degree. But they've got a lot of people, elderly people, who are resistant to vaccination, and culturally, it is not easy for Chinese people to face up to the prospect of their elderly people getting sick and dying. This is really a sort of deep-seated cultural issue.
How do you think that the UK should respond to what's going on in China, the attempts to suppress all expressions of dissent? This is just the latest example of that. We had the big speech from the Prime Minister this week, but some in his party think that perhaps the UK is softening its line against China. What do you make of the way that Rishi Sunak's government is approaching China?
Well, I think that they would do well to take a leaf out of the US book. I mean, the US, I think, have been playing this very well. President Biden's press spokesman asked about what President Biden had to say, replied nothing. The Chinese people are speaking for themselves. And I think, quite honestly, at the moment, that's the best thing we can do. There is already a narrative within China gathering momentum. The usual story: hostile foreign forces. CIA has put aside $500 million, to foment instability, to exploit the situation. All these rumors and disinformation are out there, and it's quite possible that people in the leadership, they're very prone to believe this sort of thing, because if you're a communist, you grow up in an environment of conspiracy. So I think I think the UK would be very well advised to say the necessary minimum. And not appear to be getting too closely involved at this stage, because at the end of the day, let us be honest, the Chinese Communist Party will not give a damn what Britain thinks. They will do what they need to do.
Nonetheless, there is the wider question of how we approach China. Some Conservative MPs are very concerned that the Prime Minister talked about China as a systemic challenge rather than a systemic threat. This may be semantics, but do you think that we need to be a bit more wary about the threat that China could potentially pose?
Well, I think we clearly need to recognise, the geopolitical realities of China. Having said that, I think the vehemence of some British politicians seems inversely proportionate to their understanding of China. We do need to be careful. I mean, China, we're not going to change China. If China changes, the change will come from within.
And in the meantime, do you think the government is right, for example, to buy out the Chinese stake in the Sizewell C project so that China does not get involved in those vital infrastructure programs?
Yeah, I'm always a bit puzzled about the concerns over Chinese investment in nuclear power generation in the UK, because it's not really obvious to me, if China were had malign intentions, how they would exploit those investments. At the end of the day, once these power plants are built, there are power plants. They generate power for us. The power can't be taken somewhere else. I don't think it'd be that easy for China remotely to close these facilities down. But I do think more broadly, we need to think about what constitutes strategic capabilities in this country that impact on our national security, and to be very wary about who we allow from overseas to invest in some of these things. But it's got to be sector specific, and it's got to be worked out on a detailed basis relative to the specifics of the case. But yes, certainly we need to be more aware about this.
Well, that was Nigel Inkster, former Director of Operations and Intelligence at MI6, now a senior advisor on China and cyber at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, speaking to me just a little earlier.